Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Congressman Hank Johnson's three-day series grant workshop. My name is Eric Hubbard. I have the pleasure of introducing our congressman today. Since 2007, Congressman Hank Johnson has been an advocate in the district. He's been a strong legislator, and he's also been recognized as one of the most effective legislators in the U.S. Congress. Today, Congressman Johnson is going to share with you through the process of starting your nonprofit, how to maintain your nonprofit, and also give you grant opportunities through the U.S. government. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, I introduce to you our Congressman Hank Johnson. Congressman Johnson.
Thank you, Eric, and good morning, everyone. I'm Congressman Hank Johnson, representing Georgia's 4th Congressional District, and I'd like to welcome you to the kickoff series of our grants workshop geared to individuals who desire to serve our communities but are unsure as to how they will serve. In a time of great uncertainty, housing prices have soared. The U.S. has entered its 3rd year of challenges due to the pandemic, and the cost of food has skyrocketed, not to mention the price of gas. The pandemic has exacerbated food insecurity among children in communities of color who were already challenged with hunger at a much higher rate before the pandemic. There are many people for which help is a necessity to survive and thrive, and that's why food banks, homeless shelters, transitional homes for women affected by domestic abuse, social advocacy groups, mentorships, vocational training, programs that fight those trying to overcome or that help those who are trying to overcome alcohol and substance abuse, and countless other organizations. That's why those types of organizations are so important. And these nonprofits have become the lifeline of our most vulnerable communities. One of the greatest gifts that you can give to another is through the act of service. To serve one person and provide that person with a hand up has the potential to change generations. That's how we change the world. As a matter of fact, we change it one person at a time. The individual changes the family affects the community, and the communities have the power to transform the nation and the world. This workshop is extremely important because it lays the foundation for how to start a nonprofit so that you can begin your own personal journey of being of service to others. Nonprofit organizations play a vital role in building communities by providing critical services that contribute to the economic, emotional, and even physical stability of those being served. Becoming a nonprofit leader allows you to be seen and allows you to be the eyes, ears, and voice of the people. And this is not a situation that you are to take lightly, but soberly, with dedication and with understanding that you are making a significant contribution to bettering the lives of others through service. I'd like to thank Karen Beevor, President and CEO of the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, and today's presenter, Jack Beckford, for taking the time to share with us the essential knowledge needed to start a nonprofit. My hope is that each of you will take this valuable information and serve our communities with honor and distinction, making positive differences in the lives of all whom you touch, while building a better society for all who will come behind us. Thank you all so much, and enjoy today's event.
Okay, thank you, Congressman Johnson. I appreciate being here, appreciate this opportunity to talk with many of your constituents, and I hope we have some people that will help move this forward. I'm Jack Beckford. I've been in the Atlanta area for over 40 years and have started a nonprofit in the past, ran one for a while, have done fundraising for nonprofits. Actually, the first first one that I worked on when I first came to Atlanta was in South DeKalb County. I rented a little bit of office space at the corner of Candor and Glenwood over 40 years ago. So certainly familiar with the area. I've been doing this a long time. What we're going to do today is go through a lot of the information about the technical aspects of starting up a new nonprofit, what people want to do, how you want to help set it up, how you want to consider what you're doing, what your role will be, and then some of the legal steps, some of the planning steps, some of the long-term things you have to consider, but we're going to be focusing on those first initial steps, which is where I'm assuming most of you all are now. So we'll spend some time going through that. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end. But at the same time, for those of you who have used Zoom in the past, you probably are familiar with the question and answer function, which should be down at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions as I go through the presentation today, please go ahead and click on the question and answer icon and put your questions in. As I'm going through this, I will be talking. I have to pay a good bit of attention to that, but I will also be monitoring that question and answer box. So I will try to take some of the questions as we go through. I won't be able to answer all of them as we go through, but if there are some that are particularly helpful to clarify something I'd said, I will try to get to it. And then at the end, we'll go back and we'll review some of those questions. So please, if you have questions, if you don't understand something I'm saying early on, get it into that box. And if I can get to it during the presentation, I will try to do that. The plan is to be out of here by about 11:30, be on about an hour and a half, just so everybody knows what we're doing. Okay. All right. As you see, I head up a consulting practice at this point. My background here, I've done organizational development. I do fundraising, planning, board training, assessments, and nonprofits. I've worked with over 90 nonprofits as a consultant. But in the past, I did start my own nonprofit. And then I've been a chair of the board of 3 different nonprofits. And I've been in a grant-making chair for 2 different foundations, one of which is in DeKalb County, the Fund for Southern Communities. I was there for 13 years. I hope some of you are familiar with the Fund for Southern Communities. It's still centered in DeKalb County, works in 3 states, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Been around for, I would say, 50 years now. I can't remember exactly how long it's been around, but probably 50 years. All right. So I've been involved from a lot of different points of view, and both running one as a staff member, sitting on the board of directors, and also being a grant maker. So I'm hoping that, questions that come up or perspectives maybe asked about, I will have already worked on those issues probably in the past at one point or another. Okay. So here's a little bit of information on the Georgia Center for Nonprofits that you all may or may not be real familiar with, but there's a lot of information here. The organization is set up specifically to help nonprofits function. There's a lot of learning opportunities, a lot of resources on the website. So you can learn more about it at gcn.org. It's based in Atlanta. All right. So what I would like you to do right now, while we're just getting started, is in the chat function, please go ahead and put in your name and what experience, briefly, what experience you have with other nonprofits, whether you've been on the staff or you've been maybe on a board, or you maybe have just experienced them because you dealt with them, either as a client or as a participant, just whatever experience you have. And then if you're thinking of starting a nonprofit, which I'm assuming everybody here on the call is, or most of you at least are, One of the things that you always have to deal with in the nonprofit world, if you're in any kind of leadership capacity, is you need to be able to describe that nonprofit real briefly. Sometimes it's called an elevator speech or a real brief description of your nonprofit. So I want to give everybody a little practice here today, and it'll be helpful to everybody else on the screen. Put in the purpose of the nonprofit that you're thinking of, if you have one, but try to do it in 9 words or less. Describe to us what it is you're trying to do, but describe it really briefly if you can. And then everybody else will be able to see what it is you're thinking about. And it may end up, there could be 2 or 3 of you thinking about doing the same thing. And it could be useful for you all to get together and plan it together rather than doing it all individually. So go ahead and do that in the chat function as we're going through this. Okay. All right, our objectives today. Hopefully at the end of this class, you're going to be able to recognize most of the legal, financial, planning, governance, and fundraising steps that you'll need to go through to not only set up the nonprofit, but to really be on solid ground for operating it long term. And doing this is not easy. I hope nobody thinks, oh yeah, this is something I can get done in the next month, because that's not. But as Congressman Johnson was saying, in the long run, nonprofits are really valuable to the community. And if you all come up with something that is not yet being dealt with, and a need that's out there that's not being addressed adequately, it can make a real difference over time. The other side, though, is a lot of people, when they go through this process, they figure out, and I'm going to stress this a little bit, it doesn't always make sense to start your own nonprofit. There may be lots of other opportunities where there's somebody already doing something real close to what you're wanting to do. And it might make sense, instead of starting a nonprofit right now, to join up, volunteer with, become a partner with another nonprofit that's already out there. So I'm going to talk about sometimes the advantages of doing that instead of starting your own nonprofit. So we want you to be able to think through how to do it, but also, is it really the right thing to do? All right. So at the end, I'm hoping you're going to be able to have a good feel for both of those. Okay. All right. The agenda, we're going to go through these steps, sort of an assessment of why you're thinking about it and what the need would be, how to put together how feasible it might be and what kind of plan you've got. And then I want to talk about some of the things that nonprofits are now expected to be able to articulate to the community around them. And this is where it gets into not just setting it up, but setting it up in such a way that you're going to be able to get support both from individual supporters and also institutional supporters. And it's important to be able to do that. So I'm going to introduce you to some of the language and some of the expectations that funders and supporters will be expecting of you and expecting of nonprofits. Now, some of you already work in nonprofits or experienced in them. You may know a lot of this. There are going to be others of you that are so new that this may be some new language. So we're going to go over that. Again, this is a brief presentation. It's all in 1 hour. So we can't cover everything. I certainly can't cover things in detail, but we will touch on it. All right. Then there's also legal considerations that you'll need to take into account. We'll go over some of those. Obviously, there are financial considerations that you'll need to keep in mind. There are fundraising concepts that you need to be aware of, fundraising ideas, kind of fundraising realities, and then all kinds of operational issues that you'll need to take into account as you move forward. Again, we're not going to go into details of all those, but ideas that you'll need to be thinking about and prepared for as you get a nonprofit up and going. Okay. I see a lot of people's information getting into the chat. Appreciate that. It's useful to see. I don't have time to read all of them, but I'm glancing at them as they're going through. All right. So the first part here is something that some of you maybe already have done, depending on kind of how far you are along in envisioning this nonprofit. But this is important to go through if you haven't gone through it, or if you've missed some of these steps. It'll just help you get ready and make sure you're on the right track here. So the first one, obviously, is it's a little bit of an assessment, is what is the need that you're really trying to address? You want to be able to answer that question yourself, but you also need to be able to explain it to somebody else. And we'll go through that in a little while, the importance of this, all right? And then as you think about that, also, is the need such that somebody else is going to be able to support it? It will be interested in supporting it, will help pay for it. In other words, it's not something that just you are concerned about. Are other people also going to be concerned, or can you convince them enough to be concerned so that they will come in and join you? All right. And then the next question, what point are you in your life where you're going to have time to do this, depending on what your role is planning on being? A lot of people want to just help get a nonprofit started, but not necessarily stay involved with it long term. Some people want to get one started and help govern it long term, help kind of help it along, do a little bit of directing, but not necessarily work on it every day. Others of you might be interested in not only starting one, but working on it every day. A lot of founders, when they start a nonprofit, really want to be the director, the staff boss, all right, so that you will be working on it 50, 60 hours a week. And that's kind of what it takes from somebody who comes in as an initial founder, or even beyond that. So you need to understand kind of, are you ready in your life to do whatever it is that you're thinking you're going to do for this nonprofit? Why are you doing it, and what's your role going to be? All right. But then there's that question, do we really need a new nonprofit? Or can I work with somebody else? Is there some other organization that's already doing this that maybe instead of starting a nonprofit, I can just help them out? And those are all questions that you kind of need to clarify. All right, ask yourself. But then here's the next question. All right, take these things kind of in order. After you do that assessment yourself, then you need to do some research to answer some of those questions. And this is where you get out of your own head and you move to what I call a kitchen table cabinet, or an advisory group. And this could just be a group of friends. It could be family members. It could be members that you're in a faith group with. A lot of different configurations for how this what I'm calling a kitchen table cabinet gets put together. These are just the people you want to talk through about some of that research that you just did, that assessment yourself. Is there a need? What's your role going to be in it? Get those other people with you to consider the same thing, all right? Make sure that you're comfortable with the answers, not only that you're doing yourself, but as you start with this little advisory group or kitchen table cabinet, go through these steps with them. Make sure that you're not just doing something that kind of makes sense in your head, but didn't make sense to anybody else around the table. That might be a real good indication. Wait a minute, you're a little off target if nobody's agreeing with you. All right. If you can't get anybody to agree with you around your own kitchen table, then maybe you don't have quite what you need to get the whole thing started. All right. But then there's research to do about the needs that we already talked about, do some research out in the community, and then reach out into the community and start doing interviews. Once you've run ideas around with your advisory group, with your kitchen table cabinet, no formal name here, just this group of people that you're consulting with. Then you go out and do some interviews around the community to increase your level of knowledge about what's going on, all right? And what we're talking about now is this feasibility of this new organization, all right? And defining what it is you're wanting to try to do, all right? You need to define the mission, what I already talked about as far as, well, what was the need? Now you need to be thinking in terms of, all right, I know there's a need out there, but if we have an organization, if we start a new nonprofit, what's going to be the mission of that nonprofit? Can you define what you're going to have to be accomplishing over time within that nonprofit? Can you come up with some specific goals that nonprofit will be trying to meet? Can you come up with the services that it's going to provide in order to meet those goals? And this is going to be different for every person. There's, I'll use an example that seems to be easy enough for most everybody to understand. If you're thinking of a nonprofit, or if you're thinking of a need for young, say, teenagers, middle schoolers or early high school people, all right? And you think of some of the issues around that age group in your community. Well, if you define a mission to improve the lives of middle schoolers or middle teenagers, all right? Think of all the different goals and services that nonprofits, the school system, your faith groups, community groups do and work with that same group of people. In other words, there's lots of different ways, both educationally, spiritually, socially, financially. There's lots of different ways to try to work with that group. And you can't just come up with a mission and say, well, we want to help teenagers. And you've got to be more specific than that. So you need to define that mission. You can use that as your mission, but what kind of goals are you going to set within that? Are you going to improve the educational system? You want to work in the public schools? You want to start your own school? Do you want to do after school work? Do you want to do weekend work? Do you want to do athletic work? Do you want to do faith work? There's all kinds of different ways to address the same kinds of issues. So you need to be able to articulate exactly where you're going and what your thoughts are about how you're going to accomplish that. All right. So then you look at the market, and what I defined as middle teenagers, obviously that would be a large market. But as you come up with your mission and your specific goals and the specific programs you're talking about, you need to be thinking, all right, is that a large enough market that there will be the support that I'm going to need? Is it going to attract the kind of funding that we would need to pull off whatever services we want to provide? All right, so when you go through that little process, then you think, all right, what's the competition, or who is already working on that? All right, because you probably aren't going to come up with much in the Atlanta area, where there's a whole lot of nonprofits and a whole lot of things going on, that somebody else, some other organization, isn't already doing something close to what you're thinking about. All right, hopefully you've come up with something that's maybe a little bit of a new slant, but you're not going to come up with anything that nobody has thought of at all in some broad way. So you need to make sure that you understand who the competition is. All right, and when I say competition, it's not like they're going to be competing with you necessarily, but they're already working in the same general area. All right, and this is important because of this next question. All right, who do you think will be the funding sources? Where are you going to get your income and money and volunteers and cooperation, partnerships, and so forth? Where is all that going to come from? All right. Well, over time, as you're going to start reaching out to other people in other places, the previous question becomes really important. Who else is doing this? Because if you go to a funder or you go to somebody that you're looking for support from, and they say, well, what about organization ABC? They're already doing the same thing. And if you're sitting there in front of somebody and they ask you about organization ABC that they know is doing the same thing, and you don't even know who they are, or you haven't talked with them enough that you have much of an understanding of what they're doing, what the difference is in what you're thinking about and what they're already doing. If you can't describe those differences in front of somebody else and they ask you the question, they're going to think, well, wait a minute, why would I support this person? They don't even know about this other organization that's already doing it. So you need to pay attention and learn about that competition, all right? Because some of that competition is already getting some of the funding that's probably going to be the funding that you're going to be looking for. So you need to kind of get some knowledge of this as you're going through the process so that you have a better understanding and a better chance of representing the differences and the uniqueness of your organization going forward. All right. And then initially, there's just an incredible level of different resources that are needed to start an organization, right? If you're talking about, running some neighborhood youth groups, it may not cost much at all to get that started. You may not have to pay staff, you may not have to get many facilities, you may not have to have a whole lot of resources. You may be able to do it with a very few number of committed volunteers so that you could run a nonprofit without much money, without many resources, without huge infrastructure or anything like that. But if you're talking about addressing, say, health issues, then maybe you're talking about needing a whole lot more money. So you just have to have an understanding of the kind of program that you're thinking about putting together. How much is it going to cost? And we're not talking exact figures here necessarily, but you need to have a pretty decent understanding of the general area. Are you going to need, say, $5,000 a year to keep it going? Are you going to need $50,000? Are you going to need $500,000? Obviously, the planning to get it going is going to be different depending on which of those levels you're thinking about. All right. Then the next question is one that a lot of people kind of misunderstand when they're first starting up the idea of starting a nonprofit, and that's who's going to govern it. All right. And when I say govern, it's who controls it. A lot of people will use the word, well, I want to start my own nonprofit. And in a sense, if you're talking about a 501c3 nonprofit, which is what most of this is about today, and we'll talk about a little differences here in just a minute. But if you're talking about a 501c3, you're talking about an organization which is set up and has to be a benefit to the general public, to a broad group, all right? And in order to do that, the IRS, which is where they will approve you for 501c3 status, you have to demonstrate to them that you're being governed in such a way that the control of this organization represents the public interest, and that your governing group, typically called a board of directors or a board of trustees, is not, say, your family. It's not you and your brother and your sister and your mother and your father, because the whole purpose is to benefit the public, and it's not to help you out. It's not to help get you a job, help get some resources into a small, definite group. It's to provide some kind of public welfare. And for the IRS to approve you for getting tax-free money and letting your donors take credit for the donations they're giving you, you have to convince them that the public is being represented by this board of directors. It can't just be represented by you. The IRS, if they think you're the sole beneficiary of this, then they're not going to give you that 501c3 status. So you need to present a board of directors to them that will convince the IRS that you have people on your board who are governing this, who are responsible and will take the general welfare into account rather than just your well-being. So a lot of people that start a nonprofit, they put themselves in as first executive director. That's not an unusual scenario. Doesn't always work that way, but it's not an unusual scenario. And once their board of directors is there, the board of directors may determine, well, wait a minute, this is a good idea. It's a great project to move forward, but you're not necessarily the best person to run it. And the board of directors usually has one of their responsibilities that we'll go over in a little while is their responsibility is to make sure that this organization is the most effective that it can be and that it's moving forward effectively, legally, and of doing what it's supposed to be doing. And they may decide that you as the founder aren't the right person to do that. And part of their job is to fire you. They not only have to approve any hiring of the director, but they have to also fire the director if the director is not the right person to do it. So this is not your organization. There is going to be a board of directors that's going to govern this organization. So when people say it's my nonprofit, that's not really an accurate use of the language. It's no one person's nonprofit. It's a public entity that's governed for the public good. All right. So after you kind of go through that thinking and you have all that kind of worked out in your own head, then you figure out, all right, where are my next steps? All right. If it's all still making sense after going through this whole process and you're really thinking, well, still sounds like I need to start this thing, then you need to start putting it down on paper. And when I say on paper, in writing. Obviously now it's not necessarily on paper in a computer, in some instances, a lot of instances, but you need to be able to put it down so that other people will also understand this now, because you're going to have to present this to other people. All right. So you've just been thinking about it and talking about it, but now you need to start putting it down. What's that need that you discovered? You need to be able to articulate that. Is there a gap among all the existing organizations that are out there that you feel like needs to be addressed strongly enough that you're going to start a whole new organization to address it? All right. What are you going to do to fill that need? What kind of programs are you going to try to do to address the need that's out there? And then can you articulate who it is that you're talking about? Who's that target market that you think is in great enough need that you have to start a whole organization to address it, right? And then here now again, back to this competition to who else is actually out there doing it. Why are you different? You need to not only think you're different in your head, but you need to be able to convince other people that you are different from the other organizations out there already doing it. If you can't convince other people, then you're not going to get any support. All right. And then in this plan, again, thinking about, you're going to be using this to go to funders, to supporters. You're going to need to be able to describe your organization, its history, and the people involved in such a way that you're going to convince people to give you funding or support. Well, this obviously gets a little tricky if you're going after funding and somebody says, well, what have you done? And you're talking about a brand new organization that hasn't done anything yet. So it's very tricky and hard to get over the hurdle with potential funders of how do you convince them you're going to be effective as an organization if you haven't done anything as an organization? All right, you have no history yet. But what you do have is you have people, because you already would have pulled together this governing group a little bit. You already have that group. I think back to the kitchen table cabinet that I talked about. You've already got that group. You've already talked to lots of other organizations, so you know what they're doing. And you've got people, hopefully, already committed to being on your board of directors or your volunteers or in your support group, and each of them has history. You have history. So while you won't be able to describe the history of the organization, you will be able to describe the history of the people who are already committed to working on it. And that's the only thing you have going for you at this point. You can talk about that mission. You can talk about the gap that's out there. You can talk about the need that's out there. But if you can't convince people you're going to be able to fill it and do this effectively, the only way you can do that is to describe what the people involved have already accomplished in other situations. And this is where this group of volunteers and your board of directors, this governing body, becomes so important. So that's a good bit of what you're going to have to work on early on. All right, we'll get into more of that in a minute. All right. Then you're also going to have financial projections that you're going to need to be making sure are reasonable. You're going to have to be able to describe generally, roughly, what your budget is going to be. And again, this is that, I use do you need 5,000, 50,000, or 500,000? You don't have to know exact amounts, but you have to be in the ballpark. And then not only in what your expenses are going to be, but you're going to need a funding plan for how you're going to raise those expenses. And again, you can't promise anybody that what you're planning on and the projections you're doing, you're going to be able to meet. But you need to be able to describe it in close enough detail and with enough detail that it sounds reasonable to funders who know these issues from an organizational standpoint, perhaps even better than you. They're going to know if your funding plan is feasible and has a chance of succeeding. Part of that is, again, the people that you've got involved. Do the people have a history of being able to raise some of these resources? Do you have the connections to be able to get to the funders? And the funders are going to know that because they deal with nonprofit organizations. A lot of them, it's their full-time job. I worked for 13 years in a foundation where my full-time job was knowing about nonprofit organizations in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia that were doing the kind of work we wanted to fund, and with the kind of organization that we wanted to fund. So I knew well over 100 organizations. So when new people came in, I had a really good understanding when they presented me to a plan, if they had any reasonable chance of pulling this off. All right. Because I've been doing it for 13 years and I've been reading proposals and funding groups, and that's who you're going to be talking with. You're going to be talking with people that have that kind of experience and that kind of knowledge of the area. So you're going to need to make sure you've got a real reasonable plan, because you're going to be talking with people that will know if it's reasonable or not. All right. Now, some language that you may or may not be familiar with here. The theory of change, I won't go into it in great detail, but it's language that's out there in the nonprofit world right now. It's been there for maybe 10 years, or maybe a little less than that. Excuse me. It's a term that a lot of funders now may ask you about, or you may see it on a funding proposal. They're going to request, hey, tell us about your theory of change. All right, and then they're going to say, "But what's your intended impact?" Those are words that are getting pretty common in the nonprofit world. So, real briefly, the theory of change includes a lot of the things that I've already talked about, and a lot of the things that you probably know about. Your theory of change is identifying what the need is. We've already talked about that, and identifying how you're going to address that need. What kind of programs do you want to be running? It also then will talk about how you're going to measure the impact and the steps along the way in accomplishing the mission that you're defining. Not only what is your mission, but what are the goals toward reaching it? What are the objectives that I'm going to kind of measure my progress by? And what's that impact that I'm going to have in the next, say, 5 to 10 years? And obviously, you don't know for sure what's going to be happening in 10 years in much detail, but you want to be able to make some projections of what you want to have happened in the next 10 years. And you need to make sure that what you want to have happen because of your nonprofit in the next 5 to 10 years, that you've got the kind of program described with the strategies and the goals and the objectives that you've talked about a little bit earlier. All of that, all of those considerations come together in one kind of document, and that's what your comprehensive theory of change is. Now, there's for example, at the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, there's a whole day class about identifying this theory of change. So I've given it to you in 1 minute. So obviously this is a very brief description, but if you get the question, what is your theory of change? That's what's being talked about. It's that comprehensive pulling together a consistent mission, goals, objectives, how you're going to be accomplishing it, what you're going to be accomplishing, and what impact you're going to have over time, all right? So it used to be, when I started nonprofits 40 years ago, a good mission statement and a good need was really kind of the most important thing for a lot of funders. If you could describe a good need they hadn't maybe heard a lot about, they said, "Oh, we'll support that." But there's so many nonprofits, and history has moved along so far that just having a need and just having a program outline that sounds like it's addressing it is not going to get your organization past what some other organizations are probably already doing, right? So you're going to have to come up with real specific measurements for that impact. What are you going to be accomplishing? All right. And I see somebody's asking me how many pages roughly. It's not necessary. It's not a page kind of way of measuring this. If you get to the point where a funder is actually asking you, well, what is this? What is your theory of change? They're also going to be, if that's say on a proposal outline, and they're asking you for that, they're going to say, "Oh, please do this in 100 words, or do this in 2 pages, or do this in 20 pages." When you get asked questions like this, they're also going to be giving you some kind of feel for how they want you to answer it. So, I'm just telling you, these are the kinds of things you're going to be facing, and in every situation, you're going to have to deal with it. It's the golden rule of philanthropy. All right. Now, most of us know what the golden rule is, but not many of you probably know what the golden rule of philanthropy is. The golden rule of philanthropy, unfortunately, the golden rule of philanthropy is those that have gold make the rules. In other words, if you're going after the gold, if you're looking to somebody for some funding support, and when I say gold, we're talking about money now. If you're looking for somebody for some money, guess what? They're the ones that get to make up the rules for how they're going to give it to you and what they're going to need from you in order to give it to you. So in every foundation, every government agency, every individual has their own little idiosyncrasies of who they're going to fund and how they're going to make those decisions. And if you want money from them, you got to do what they're saying. Basically, they get to make the rules for who they give the money to. So somebody may say, oh, I just need a 2-page description of all of this, the theory of change, what your budget is, what your intentions are, what your impact's going to be, and they want you to do that in a 2-page letter. One of the examples that we're looking at today, and what I think a lot of people on this call are starting to think about, is federal monies. Well, I can assure you there are no federal programs out there that you can apply to that you're going to be able to write a 2-page letter and get any funding. Federal money doesn't come that way. Federal money is, you spend 2 weeks working on a proposal, filling in all kinds of information. So it just, there's no easy way to tell you how detailed all of this information has to be, but you have to address that every time, all right? So these are the things you need to be addressing, and then over time, you'll figure out how detailed it needs to be. If you're a brand new group, nobody's expecting you to have the same kinds of answers in some of these instances as groups that have been around 20 years that can do more detailed work, all right? All right, so that's an overview of what you need to be dealing with. All right, that's kind of the background for what you're trying to accomplish over time and what you need to be putting in place. What I'm going to do now is move toward some of the legal logistical steps for actually legally setting up this organization. All right. So we'll run through this so that you understand some of the real logistical, these are the legal steps that you'll need to accomplish. All right. To set up a nonprofit, your first step is you have to incorporate in the state. If you're going to be in the state of Georgia, you incorporate in the state of Georgia. All right. And you do that through the Georgia Secretary of State. Now, just to make sure you understand the difference, this is a nonprofit organization. It's a corporation. This is different than having that corporation then become a 501c3 IRS certified corporation. All right. So the first step is you have to found the corporation. You have to start it. And that's all done in the state of Georgia at the Georgia Secretary of State website. The next step after that, a much more complicated step, is to get the IRS to approve your nonprofit for 501c3 status. But those are entirely different processes. You do that with the IRS at their website, all right? So first you have to start at the state of Georgia, and this is the easy step, all right? This can happen in almost a day. You have to do some groundwork for it, but it happens real quickly. You reserve the name, come up with a name you want for your nonprofit, and you can actually pay Georgia some money and reserve that name, and they'll check and make sure nobody else has it, and they'll tell you, yeah, you can name a nonprofit that. Then you have to understand a little bit of a purpose statement. Then you go to their website and you start filling in their application to become a 501, to become a nonprofit organization. They won't be dealing with the 501c3. Remember, they're just going to make you a nonprofit. All right. So you go in how to incorporate, and a little form will come up, and they're going to ask you for 3 incorporators, one of whom has to be the registered agent, has to have a physical address, can't be a P.O. box. And it doesn't have to be necessarily even where the organization is going to function, but it has to be a physical address that the state is going to use as the name and the person that they're going to get in touch with if they have to reach the organization. So you have to tell them who that is. If you're a student and if you're living in a dorm or something, you don't want to be the registered agent because you need a physical address that's going to be somewhat stable. So make sure whatever this is going to not change too much over time. You can change it, but you'd rather not have to, right? And then you have to have 2 officers. You have to have a president and you have to have a secretary. They can't be the same person, all right? Now, those people don't necessarily have to be board members later on, but these are just the people who are forming the corporation, right? And then you file the articles of incorporation at the Georgia Secretary of State website, right? And basically you're filling in, they're asking you, what's your name? What's your purpose? Who's your registered agent? Who's your president? Who's your secretary, all right? And when you answer that question, it fills in automatically on a form that they have in front of you, which is the articles of incorporation, right? At the end of those questions, and as you're filling it in, there's a box and it says something like, do you have any other additional items or additional language or supplemental language that you want to add? And you don't know, if you've never done this before, you're thinking, no, that's all I want to say. Well, that's a little bit of a catch, because if you don't put in any information in this supplemental language box, this additional language, then later when you get to the IRS and you start applying for your 501c3, you have to come back and make some changes on these initial articles of incorporation, because there are going to be some things that you haven't put in that the IRS requires. So I'm showing you now how you get that additional language so you don't have to come back later, pay more, and change your articles of incorporation. There's supplemental language for the 501c3, which you can find. It's tricky to find. You can put in supplemental language in the IRS search box and perhaps come up with it, but it's also available if you go to the instructions for the IRS Form 1023-EZ, and you'll know more about that later, but this is where you find it. There's some instructions for that. And on page 4 and 5 of those instructions, as you're going to be applying for that 1023-EZ, they're going to be asking you questions, and that's what's on page 4 and 5. And they're going to ask questions. They're going to say, do your articles of incorporation include language about the dissolution of your assets? Well, the Georgia Secretary of State never asked you for that, but the IRS requires it. And then the IRS on these pages say, if you have language such as, and then they give you 2 or 3 sentences exactly what they need you to say. Well, obviously, if that's what they need you to say, the easiest way to do it is when you're first putting together these articles of incorporation, go to those pages, get that language, copy them, paste them in that extra box where the Secretary of State is saying, do you want to have any other terms? And there's 3 questions that the IRS is going to ask you about, and they're all on those pages. It's about the role of the board, the dissolution of all your assets, and how it functions. Go ahead and the IRS gives you an example of the language that they want. So go ahead and go into that instruction form, get that language, copy it, paste it back into your articles of incorporation. All right. And then you also have to publish an intent to incorporate in your county legal newspaper. All right. So you figure out what your legal newspaper is in the county where you are, and you have to send them $40, and you have to send them a little statement that you're going to be incorporating this nonprofit. All right. And you have to go through those steps. All right. When you do that, then you will immediately get back within a day, usually, your approval from the Secretary of State and a control number where you have now become a legally incorporated nonprofit in the state of Georgia. All right. So you are a legal nonprofit at that point. It's within a day after you give them that information. All right. But in order to really move on, then you also have to get your federal IRS employer identification number, EIN. This is the same basically as your Social Security number for an individual. This is the Social Security number for the organization. This is what a bank is going to have in order to open up your account for you. If you don't have this EIN for your nonprofit, not many banks are going to open an account for you. All right, so you have to get that. You can apply for that at the IRS website. It doesn't cost you anything. You just give them basically some of the same, they ask you some questions and you give them the same information that you just gave to the Secretary of State. All right, and you get back the EIN sometimes within 30 seconds. It comes back to you. It's just, that becomes your Social Security number for your organization. All right, so once you do that, then you've got the information. You're a legal nonprofit in the state of Georgia. and you're registered with the federal government, and you are a nonprofit, you can open a bank account. All right. Now, from here on out, though, it's things that you're going to have to do to operate more and to get funding, to set up the organization in such a way that it's going to be eligible for the 501c3 status, which is probably what you're looking for with the IRS. So now you have to go into organizing a board of directors. And I've talked about this a little bit, and we'll talk about it a little more, but this is the group of people that are going to be responsible for the organization. We'll get to a little bit of detail more there. I recommend at least 5 people here. There's no magic number. You're not required to have anything more than 1. But if you want support over time, you're going to need, I think, a minimum of 5. There are boards that get huge. There's one nonprofit in Atlanta that has over 100 people on their board of directors. Most of them have somewhere between 7 to 15. I certainly think 5 is not an unusual number to get started with. These are people who are volunteering their time primarily, going to actually be donating money to your group. So, you need to be careful with who you're choosing, but over time, you need to build this up. They're going to be providing a lot of volunteer services. So when you first get started, they have to have a founding meeting to kind of incorporate themselves, and then they have to develop their bylaws, which is how they're going to operate, what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, who the officers are going to be, how often you're going to elect new boards, that kind of information. All right. Then at some point after they get all that done, you also have to have some of the funding plans that we already dealt with, some of the budget projections that we already dealt with. And once you have all of that information in place, at that point, you can apply for the 501c3 with the IRS, right? But this may be a couple months after you've started, because getting those bylaws, getting the funding plan, getting the budget, all of that going can take a good while. Sometimes it'll take a year or 2, all right? You hope it doesn't take that long, but it can, all right? Then you apply for this 501c3 with the IRS. This is a much lengthier process, a much more detailed application. All right. Depending on the size, there's a couple different forms. The form 1023EZ is if you're projecting that your annual income for the first 3 years is going to be under $50,000 a year. If you're going to be over $50,000 a year, then you need to use a full form 1023 instead of the 1023EZ. Full form 1023 costs $600. So you have to decide which of those you're going to use, and it has to be based on some realistic expectations. And then you fill out that application. It's not necessarily an easy process. This is an IRS form. It gets complicated. The full form 1023 is a lot more complicated than the short form, the EZ form. If you can get away with using the EZ, do that. If you expect it to be under 50,000, but you go over it like a year later a little bit, it's not like you get in any trouble, but you want to make a realistic estimate what your expectations are for your new group. All right. And then depending on where you are, you may need to get a city or a county business license. And again, that's going to depend on where you are. That's going to change it. If you're in the city of Atlanta, you have to have a city license. If you're other places, you don't. Some counties require. All right. Now, so let's go back to the board of directors. All right. Here's their roles and responsibilities. I've already talked about some, but this is the group that holds the real responsibility for operating this organization. Are you doing it legally? Are you being effective? Are you being ethical? Are you working efficiently? Are you accomplishing what the purpose and what your mission is? Are you moving toward that? They're the ones that have to determine all this. Their role includes promoting and fundraising for the organization. All right. And remember, I've already mentioned, basically, this is the group that can hire and is responsible for supervising the executive director, which also means they can fire the executive director. So that's what the governance body, this is what the board is responsible for. So if you think about it, one of the questions I had earlier is how many you want on your board? Well, these are volunteer people. It's not like one or two people can be doing all of this. So the larger your board can get, it gets more complicated, but you're going to have more people involved in all of these responsibilities and all these jobs. So think about that as you put this board together. What kind of skills and who do you want on this board? All right. So depending on what you're doing, the skills may be a little different. And everybody probably ought to try to get somebody that's experienced in nonprofits. Everybody ought to try to get somebody that knows how to read financial statements, maybe knows a little bit about fundraising, knows how to work together. But it's going to vary depending on what kind of programs you're doing as to who exactly makes the most sense to be on your board of directors, right? How are you going to go about finding them? How many are you going to have and how are they going to be managed? Finding them, you can go back to your kitchen cabinet a little bit. Remember that group that we started with? Are some of those people now potential candidates for being on your board of directors? All right. When you did the interviews with your competitors, the other organizations doing similar work, one of the things you can ask when you're in a situation like that, you can say to them, well, you've been around 20 years, you're having the conversation. You've been around 20 years. Are there some people that you've had on your board in the past that are maybe not on your board anymore that you think might be willing to work with me to help put together this new organization? You may find board members by asking those kind of questions, all right? So that's how you help put together your board. Now, there's also a couple training programs in Atlanta. The Atlanta Women's Foundation actually does a training program called Women on Board, where they train women to how to be an effective board member. And then at the graduation of that 6-month training program, they have a big program and they invite nonprofits to come in and try to recruit their new graduates for getting on their board. So you can use that. United Way in Atlanta has a very similar program where they will train people and then help nonprofits get them onto their boards. So there's lots of different ways of finding your board members. How will they be managed? You would prefer to have that board kind of taking its own responsibilities, managing themselves, but they're going to have those bylaws that they have to approve. If the executive director of the nonprofit shouldn't have to spend too much time managing the board, but the director of the nonprofit isn't going to be working if that board doesn't function well. So you certainly want to be spending some time. The board should manage itself, but sometimes it's going to need some help. All right. Now, annually, I'm going to start speeding up a little bit here because I don't want to take away from too much of the time for questions, even though I've seen very few questions yet. And so please put in questions as I'm going through this now. Annually, once you get up and going, once you get your 501c3, once you're all incorporated and everything, then every year you have to re-register with the Secretary of State. They'll send you a reminder. It costs $30 just so the state knows you're still working. All right. And then once you're up and going a little bit, you also have to register for charitable solicitation in the state. It's a form C-100, costs $35. There's lots of exemptions from having to do this charitable registration. So you can check this out. You don't have to do it when you first get started, but once you're up and going, you need to start filling in this form. There are a lot of exemptions from it, so check and see if your group is going to be needing it or not. But it's an annual thing with a $35 cost. Then there's also a federal form that you have to file. This is like your income tax form for the organization. You don't end up having to pay any income taxes, but you still have to report. And that's a form 990. And depending on what your income is, you either use the form 990EZ, 990N, or a full 990. The N is if your income is less than $50,000, you can file the N, which is a very short online form. If you're over $50,000 but under $200,000, you can file 990EZ, which is still fairly short and fairly easy. Once you get over $200,000, you have to file the full form 990, and that's much more complex. You need a CPA or a really experienced person to file that for you, and that has to be done every year. Even though you're not paying them any money, if you don't file that form for 3 years in a row, you automatically lose your 501c3. So you don't want to ignore this, even though you don't have to pay any money with it, right? And then annually, you're required to hold at least one board meeting, and you have to have minutes. That's just to maintain the fact that, yeah, you're a functioning organization. Obviously, though, for good practices, you need to hold more than one board meeting a year, because you remember what all those roles and responsibilities are for your board members. For the board, they've got a lot of work to do. So they can't do this with one board meeting a year. But legally, that's all you have to have in the state of Georgia. Obviously, you want more, but nobody else, they don't really care. They're not requiring you to meet. It's just, if you're not going to get very far if they don't. All right, but now here's where it comes in. Maybe you don't have to do any of that, right? I hope that makes it sound like a whole lot of work, which it is, to do those organizations and to get the support you need. It's not easy to start an organization and convince people to get you money. I wish it were easy, but it's not, because there's a lot of people trying. All right. So depending on what you're thinking about, if you just want to do the program work, if you have some idea of doing some programs, can you volunteer with one of those existing groups that are already doing something similar? All right. Can you merge your board and your group of supporters and volunteers in with another existing organization? And this is where a lot of people get thinking, oh, wait a minute. I don't want to be filling out all those IRS forms. I don't want to be having to work with the Secretary of State. I just want to help kids. Well, if that's the case, then maybe one of those competitive groups that we already talked about earlier could use you as a volunteer, could use your group of volunteers to come in and help them, right? So that makes a lot of sense. If you're pretty new, you might not want to start a whole organization, but go to one of those groups that are already in the same field and work with them for a while. Or use what's called a fiscal sponsor. And now we're getting kind of into a legal area here, all right, about what this fiscal sponsor is and the pros and cons of that, all right? A fiscal sponsor is an existing organization, perhaps one of those groups that you talked with earlier, where they already have a 501c3. All right, so they're already doing all of those legal technical requirements we already talked about. And you negotiate with them to say, well, I want to do this work. Yeah, and you might say to them, I have a network of funders. I can bring in my own funding. I can run these programs. You don't have to do any extra work. I just don't want to do the legal work, the IRS work. So you negotiate with them to do your bookkeeping for you, because they're already going to have a bookkeeping. So, whatever finances you've got, they can just put it in their own bookkeeping system. In order to do that, now, keep in mind, they're doing the legal, they're a 501c3, they're taking on the legal responsibilities for their organization and now your work. So when somebody writes you a check, the checks are actually made payable to this other organization, to this fiscal sponsor, right? And you have to have enough trust and a contract, a negotiated contract, so that you're going to get that money, but they're going to take some kind of fee for doing this work for you. And this fee can range anywhere up to 20% sometimes. So you have to decide kind of how much work they're doing for you and how much you can afford to pay them out of the income that you're bringing in. So checks are made out in their name, coming to you. They're going to file the IRS reports we already talked about. They're going to have their auditing being done. So they're doing a lot of work for you, and they're going to charge you something for it. But a lot of people find out this is the good way to go. So it can get complicated. You need a group you trust, and they need to trust you. But that can be an option for somebody. It saves you a lot of work and doesn't cost you very much money, probably. All right. Now, so you've got all that done. You've now set up your organization. You've got your governing board. You're functioning. Now, I really want to whip through now just to remind you of some of these other issues that are going to be out there long term. So we're not going to go into any detail here. I'm going to whip through this, and then we're going to open it up for even more questions, which again are not showing up. So I'm either doing a better job than I anticipated, or you're overwhelmed and don't even know what questions to ask. All right. So I'm going to whip through a whole bunch of other operational concerns now. Keep in mind, you are a legal organization at this point. You are a corporation in the state of Georgia. So you're going to have a business plan, which we already talked about. But over time, that business plan is going to change. You need to keep that in mind. You're going to have to be reviewing it and revising it all the time. You have to know how you're going to be operating, how you're going to be evaluating that success. All right. And these are good practices. This is what you're going to be needing to do. This isn't kind of the legal side of what you've already trying to accomplish. This is that operational side now. All right. You need to be thinking about who are the constituencies that you're relating to, just like any business. And your constituencies are your clientele, but they're also your funders. They're also the media. They're also possibly political networks. In other words, you all are, involved in this through Representative Johnson, the representative's office. So does that mean that you're going to have Hank Johnson's office, or the senator's office, the governor's office, the mayor's office, as a constituency that you end up needing to relate to? How are you going to do those relations? Your funders, you have to stay in touch with your funders. You have to stay in touch with other groups, with the media. So these are all considerations. If you're going to operate effectively, you're going to have to know how you're going to be doing this stuff. All right. We talked about earlier on about the budget and what your needs are going to be. Well, that's going to change over time. You're going to have to keep monitoring for that. What kind of personnel, what kind of equipment, facilities, funding, all of these, you're going to be needing to deal with questions like this all the time. How are you going to get all these? What kind of plan do you have in place to meet those needs for getting the personnel, equipment, facilities, and funding? All right. Real quick overview of this funding now. And I think you're going to get a little bit more of this in the next couple of sessions tomorrow and the next day, I guess it's 2 more days. This is something most people don't understand. Nonprofit funds, out of all the money that comes through nonprofits, there's a way to kind of look at that. Remember, every nonprofit has to file those 990 forms that I talked about. So they've gone in, people have gone in now and looked at every one of those 990s that every nonprofit files in the country every year, and they've done some analysis. 69% of all the money that comes into nonprofits comes in as fees that people pay those nonprofits. It doesn't come from fundraising. These private contributions, that next line is where the fundraising comes in, but most of the money comes in as fees. The example here would be being when you join the YMCA, you pay them a fee. It's not free to take advantage of that 501c3 organization. The largest employer in DeKalb County is a nonprofit organization. If y'all think about that a second, some of you may know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to spend too much time, but they charge over $50,000 for people to take advantage of their 501c3. It's the largest employer in DeKalb County. The answer of who that is, it's Emory University. Emory University is a nonprofit. It's a 501c3. As far as a corporate structure goes, it's the same corporate structure you're now putting together. So a lot of people think, well, when I form a nonprofit, I'm going to have to go out and get funding. Well, the funding can be, you charge people for the services of your nonprofit. 69% of the money, that's how it comes in. Government funds, which I know a lot of you probably are thinking about, because that's the kind of the scenario that we're dealing with right here today with Representative Johnson's office and the federal government involved. That's only 7% of the money that comes into nonprofits. 21% are these private contributions. Now that asks us, if you go to fundraising workshops, this is that 21% is usually what that's dealing with. So let's go to the next slide and look at where does that 21, what makes up that 21%? So that 21%, I'm now breaking down into its categories. Starting from the bottom, actually, individuals contribute 83% of that 21% support for nonprofits. So most of the contributions for nonprofits come from individuals. Corporations and businesses and foundations make up only 11%, corporations only make up 5%. And remember, this is 5% of that 21%, where the government is not quite here because that's a separate little category. But as you're thinking about how to put together your fundraising plan, you know, it's a smart idea to be thinking about, well, how am I going to try to get some money from individuals? How am I going to try to get some money from foundations? How am I going to try to get some money from corporations? Depending on what you're doing, you may end up with a whole lot more or less from each of these kinds of sources, depending on what you're doing and how good you are at raising funding. But this gives you an idea of the whole group of nonprofits. This is where their money comes from. Doesn't mean every individual group gets money from all these sources. It just gives you an idea of what the universe looks like. Okay. Now, the other thing I like to warn people is your staff and human resources, paid or volunteer, ends up one of your most problematic and dangerous, but most important areas. More lawsuits are filed against nonprofits. The largest number of lawsuits filed against nonprofits every year is from former volunteers and former staff, mostly staff. All right, so this whole arena of dealing with the people that you have to deal with in order to run an organization, it's also your biggest danger. Somebody is going to come in and say, wait a minute, I was illegally fired. I was treated badly. I was discriminated against. Somebody did something wrong. I mean, if somebody gets mad at you for whatever reason, this ends up being the most common source of lawsuits against nonprofits. So you're going to want to make sure you have a good human relations, personnel, HR people around so that you come up with good staff policies, good personnel policies and procedures, and you make sure you follow them. Nonprofits are subject to the same discrimination, the same bad management that happens in for-profits. So you need to avoid that. You want to be effective with this, and you have to pay attention to it. All right. You need to be able to monitor, do planning, and reporting of all your finances. Once you get money, people are going to ask you questions about where it came from and how you're using it. So you got to have a financial system, reporting system in place to do it. You're going to have ways to communicate internally with your staff, your board, your clients, and all those other supporters, all those various constituents we talked about. Got to stay in touch with them. You're going to have to be thinking about how you're going to get, maintain, and update all those facilities, all that equipment, whatever it is you need. Got to know how you're going to do it. All right. So, and here are the resources that we've talked about. All right. We're kind of getting to the end here. So please put in questions. I don't even have any open questions yet. So we may end up getting off of this early. But we already, these resources, are the ones that you need to get with. Georgia Secretary of State, Internal Revenue Services, Georgia Center for Nonprofits is where I'm a consultant with them. I'm on their staff. There's a lot of resources there. Place used to be called the Foundation Center. It's now called Candid, which has a database on computer of every foundation in the whole United States, what kinds of things they fund and what you need to, I'm sorry, somebody says go back to slide show 29 again, just to let you see. All right, you just need to know, what you're needing over time. It's going to change, and once you get a computer, now to start up, it doesn't mean in 5 years that same computer is going to be helpful there. So anyway, so Board Source, www.boardsource.org, is a national online, very high-powered board of directors kind of resource for training and how to pull together that board of directors, what kind of knowledge they need, how you work with them. Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta is a legal group. This is the network of basically every lawyer in the city of Atlanta. Every lawyer is required by the Bar Association to do volunteer work. And so if you have legal work that you need done for your nonprofit, they won't help you get a nonprofit started. But once you're up and operating and once you're a 501c3, you can apply at the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. And you say to them, hey, I need personnel contracts. I need a lease with this organization, or I've got legal trouble here. You apply to them, they will provide you free legal help. They will send out that notice from you to over 2,000 lawyers in the Atlanta area. And if you're working with low-income communities, they will provide you free legal assistance, volunteer lawyers. All right. TechSoup is a national, it's online. Once you're a 501c3 again, this is where the national computer programs and computer-related groups provide their pro bono, not pro bono, but very low-cost support. You can get computer programs there for almost nothing. You can get revitalized computers very, very cheaply. Again, you already have to be up and operating as a 501c3. So that's a good one to get in touch with. If there are other resources that other people know of that have been very, very helpful, go ahead and put that in the chat. And these are just some of the primary ones that I think most people end up being able to take advantage of. All right. Now, I've got no open questions here. All right. So, unless people start pouring questions in, I'm going to get to our wrap up here. All right. Thinking about what I said we were going to deal with. We're going to deal with some of the legal, financial, planning, and governance issues, and then the fundraising steps in order to set up and operate a nonprofit. And then looking at, all right, do I really need to start a nonprofit, or are there other ways that I can accomplish what I was talking about accomplishing? All right. So I hope that I've gotten you a good introduction to this. Now, the other thing I want to stress is doing all this effectively over time is not easy. To think that you can come to one workshop like this and set up a nonprofit and then apply for, especially government money, is very hard, but any kind of foundation money, business money, there's a whole lot of people already doing this. So when you start up a new one, it's very, very difficult. Your chances of success aren't real high, but of course, if you don't try, you certainly aren't going to be successful. So, I hope you have a pretty decent feel. I've put my email address there. Please, if I will be terribly disappointed if I don't end up getting any emails, because I know there's, we have 42 people on this group at this point. So I'm hoping there are some people that, have some specific questions that maybe they haven't asked today yet, but I could answer for you just via email. I'll be glad to do that. So please keep that email address in mind. And then there's the Georgia Center for Nonprofits, which is the one that asked me to do this. I'm one of their consultants, right? They have lots of training. They have a whole catalog of training. So depending on specific information that you may be interested in, get in touch with them. NU is a nonprofit university at Georgia Center for Nonprofit. Okay. Now I'm seeing a lot of comments, but not too many questions. Let me get through some of the ones I'm seeing here. With the boards you've been a member, on average, how many board meetings do you hold annually? Again, the group, the kind of organization you're a part of, it can make a difference. I was on the board of a credit union, which is required by law to hold a meeting every month because they're a federally certified nonprofit. Holding quarterly board meetings is not at all unusual. For having new boards of directors, when you're starting a new organization, you probably want to meet more because there's a whole lot to be done. It really depends on how much you can commit the people to, how much staff support is behind you. It can change over time. There's no real one answer. Certainly 4 times a year is minimal. Every other month makes sense. There's a lot of variables there. Somebody's asking about this PowerPoint. I'm assuming that Representative Johnson's office is going to make this available. I'll let somebody else come on and answer the question about how easy it will be to get this PowerPoint. I'm not involved in that aspect of it. So I'm trying to see if there's any other questions coming on. I don't see any other questions coming on. So why don't I turn this back over to Representative Johnson's staff, and they can answer the question about what's the future use of this recording and PowerPoint. So I want to thank Representative Johnson for doing this, and inviting me, and hope it's proven useful. So I will go now and turn it back over to Representative Johnson's people. There's Candace Williams coming on. Hi, Candace. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beckford, for such an informative workshop. So this video will be available to the public. I'll also like to thank everyone for taking the time to attend today's session. Please join Congressman Johnson at 10 a.m. tomorrow for the introduction to federal funding with grants.gov. If you haven't registered, please do so. I hope everybody have a great rest of your day.